Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Taylor. I'm the Dean of the Pardee School. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. And on behalf of the Pardee School of Global Studies, I want to welcome all of you to this event, From Theory to Practice, Careers in International Development and Climate Finance, co-hosted and sponsored by the Center for the Global Development and Policy Center, the GDP Center, one of our most dynamic and exciting centers that we have at Boston University. I want to thank my GDP colleagues who organized this event, especially the director, Professor Kevin Gallagher, Assistant Director Maureen Height, who's ill this afternoon, and Communications Specialist Samantha Igo, who's here. Thank you as well to the 5 outstanding panelists that we'll begin with for taking the time to participate in what I think will be a very exciting and informative discussion. And I look forward to hearing the panel and their comments and the discussion with the audience. One of the goals of the Pardee School is to equip our students to make a real-world difference in addressing global challenges. The climate crisis is an ongoing challenge, an existential one, that confronts all of us. And this panel will provide our community and this audience with the opportunity to look at how the climate crisis has transformed roles in various governmental and intergovernmental agencies, roles that I hope that Pardee students and BU students more broadly may one day also participate in and occupy themselves. My hope is that this panel will help our audience understand how to turn theory into practice, by exposing them to different careers and kinds of careers and opportunities in international development and climate finance, bridging what they learned in the classroom to the very real issue of climate change. Welcome again to the Pardee School and to Boston University. I'm grateful to all of you for being here. Let me now turn it over to my colleague and the director of the GDP Center, Professor Kevin Gallagher, Professor of Global Development Policy in the school, and you will introduce our panelists. And thank you all again.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott, and welcome everyone. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm a professor of global development policy at the Pardee School, and I'm the inaugural director of the Global Development Policy Center. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world. We've got 3 different research clusters at the center. One's called the Human Capital Initiative that advances policy-oriented research on investments in education, health, and women's empowerment across the world. Another one called the Global China Initiative that looks at China's overseas economic activity and its impacts on financial stability, human well-being, and the environment. And another one called the Global Economic Governance Initiative, which looks at the global economic governance institutions, the G20, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, et cetera, and the extent to which those institutions foster financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world. And it's in this group, the Global Economic Governance Initiative, which we've had a long-standing partnership with the Vulnerable Group of 20, which we're excited to be partnering with in this exciting week, in addition to the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS in London. Progress on achieving the Paris commitments and the UN Sustainable Development Goals has been pretty stymied. Many of us were in Washington last week, and while we've all basically committed to mobilize upwards of $3 trillion by 2030, we found out last week that last year net inflows to developing countries were negative. There is a lot of work to be done. It's been stymied by a challenging global environment with debt distress. And while we're not mobilizing this financing, we're in an environment of debt distress and what numerous folks are calling a polycrisis. We had COVID, we've had numerous climate shocks, whether that be droughts in Argentina or flooding in Durban, that have had major impacts on the ability to export and feed people across the world. We've obviously had these 2 major international geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine, and the interest rate hikes to respond to inflation in the advanced economies of the global north have also wreaked havoc across the developing world. Amid these challenges, public officials in climate vulnerable countries are working to advance nationally driven initiatives for sustainable development. For the vulnerable group of 20, the V20 as I refer to them, which is a block of what is now 68 countries from across the developing world, this materializes in what they call climate prosperity plans. The V20 was founded in 2015. It's sort of an offshoot of something called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which focused on the United Nations and the Paris Climate Agreement and that regime to try to make sure that that regime really took the most vulnerable countries seriously. And then around 2015, they realized maybe the United Nations isn't the place where we can get the money and change the financial architecture. And so they created a sister group called the V20 of finance ministers and central banks to organize and be a coalition to make sure the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable countries in the world had more voice and representation in the international financial architecture, whether that be the G20, the International Monetary Fund, and beyond. So this is somewhat of a new venture for this institution. They're opening up some offices in Washington, and we have been really privileged and have had a great time working with them in a new program which we call the Climate Prosperity Fellowship Program. These folks have these climate prosperity plans, which is how each country is going to try to meet its development and climate goals. And we had a large competition from across the membership of the V20, and we selected the group of folks that is with us today to provide public servants from the different countries with in-depth knowledge and training to address the challenges posed by our unfit for purpose global financial system with respect to climate change, and to catalyze ambitious, development-friendly, positive climate action through nationally determined CPPs. So we started this in October in Marrakesh at the World Bank meetings, and then we've had a virtual program where each week folks have been learning different techniques, whether it be modeling techniques like DDTs or debt sustainability analysis, or on how the political economy and the law and legal provisions of these different institutions work, so they can know not only how to calibrate their development plans to make sure that they can meet their climate and development goals without getting into debt sustainability, but that they can also navigate effectively within the international institutions to get their voices heard and their plans implemented. So we've really been pleased to have the inaugural group of fellows with us this week. So they all did these virtuals up until last week, and then they went with their ministers to the World Bank and IMF meetings in Washington, and then they've all been here with us this week as part of the residency component of their fellowship. They've been working really hard. Today they had a great simulation at the G20, but they've also been playing hard. Boston's a fun place to be, and if some of these folks, if their party doesn't get reelected and they have to do something outside of the finance ministry, at least some of them have a future as professional bowling experts moving forward, and it might be pretty lucrative from what I understand. So what did we want to do with this panel? It's been such a privilege to have these people from all over the world, from Togo, from Fiji, from Burundi, from Haiti, from Argentina. You know, the list goes on of the exciting folks that we've had. And we thought, hey, let's have a conversation with people at BU, with the Pardee School and beyond. So most of the people at BU want to be these folks. And they've had incredible experiences. And we're going to have a conversation with them and a handful of the people that have come here, distinguished folks who have come here and helped us in this training and this joint learning activity that we've had over the past couple weeks. And so we're going to have a conversation amongst us about some of the big issues in the world, how these folks grapple with them in their careers, and how they got to this point in their career, and how you folks might want to follow in their footsteps, or sometimes avoid some of the mistakes that they made or that were faced in front of them. So we're excited to excited to have an exciting panel for you. I guess I'll introduce each person and then maybe go up to the table as I do. So let me start with a BU alum. One of our first speakers is Ana Maria Carrasquilla. She's actually on the BU GDP Center's Alumni Advisory Board. She's got 25 years of experience, mostly in multilateral financial institutions in her region, Latin America. She served as the CEO of the Development Bank of Latin America's Asset Management Group, and prior to that, she was the chairwoman of the board and executive president of the FLAR, the Latin American Reserve Fund, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's sort of like an international monetary fund for the membership countries in the Andean region. She did that for 14 years, but she holds an LLM in banking and financial law here from Boston University. We also have Cecilia Nahan. She's an economist specializing in international affairs and development, also more than 25 years in high-level experience. Until just last December, if you followed the news, some things happened in her native Argentina at the end of last year. She was the executive director of the World Bank Group, representing the constituency of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. Previous to that, she served as ambassador of Argentina to the U.S., and Sherpa of Argentina to the G20, and she's now a senior advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank on its engagement of the G20, which is a big job given the fact that they're the lead supporting Brazil on a lot of these issues. So it's incredible, and thank you for taking time out of all that to come here and be here with all these young, exciting people. Let me also mention that we're going to have a few of the actual fellows up here with us today. We'll have Fatima Mohammed Didi. She's a debt management executive in the Ministry of Finance of the Maldives. Her primary focus is overseeing the back office operations, where she plays a pivotal role in both strategic decision-making and the day-to-day functions of the department. She joined the ministry in 2010 as a desk officer and has since assumed various roles within the organization. She's been really fun to have with us. We'll have Hillary Career, a senior economist in the Climate Finance and Green Economy Unit at the National Treasury and Economic Planning Unit of Kenya, where he's worked in previous roles for over 9 years. He's an expert on climate adaptation finance and one of Kenya's lead climate finance negotiators. Excuse me. He's also the National Treasury's National Designated Authority for the Green Climate Fund, as well as the Climate Investment Funds. He's got a master's degree in agriculture and applied economics from Egerton University in Kenya. Great to have you here with us. And Fitz Herald Lewis is the director of the Economic Studies Department at the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Haiti. Although in our G20 simulation, you were from?
Correct.
Great. In addition to supervising budget support programs agreed between the Haitian state and key development partners, he develops and monitors the implementation of numerous development projects financed by bilateral aid agencies and multilateral institutions. He's got a master's in economic analysis and international development, specializing in economic policy management. For those of you fellows who don't have a master's degree or anything like that yet, you should come. You see how beautiful the weather is here. You should come to the Pardee School, where we have a great specialization in that. Let me ask the panelists to come join me up here. I think, hey, great group of folks, yeah? We're going to sit up here. Before I open this discussion, I just want to mention that this event is being recorded, and it'll later be on our YouTube page at the GDP Center. And after a Q&A session that I'm going to do with these folks, we will open it up for we'll open it up for question and answers, and then we're going to have a short reception out in the back. But let's dive into our first round of questions. And my first question for Ana Maria Carrasquilla. For most of your career, you've worked in multilateral institutions throughout Latin America, including as an executive president of the second oldest regional financial arrangement in the world. Can you share with us some of your insights that you gained on what constitutes best practice in financing development on the ground in your region?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank you for the invitation. I'm going to talk a little bit about FLAD is a regional financial arrangement. We have 8 member countries now. They have $9 billion in financial assistance. They have 3 different credit lines. What they do is pool the international reserves of the central bank members, and they grant loans and assistance when they have balance payment problems or liquidity problems. So basically that's what FLAD does. As you said, it has a 45-year history. I was there for 14 years. What have I learned? What did I learn? What can I say about that? What has made FLAD, in my opinion, successful is that it has a very sound institutional framework. It has a very much political independence from the member countries and from the member central banks. It has a highly technical team of people working there. It's very simple in its structure. They have no bureaucracy, which allows it to have a lot of flexibility to address the needs of the member central banks when they are in crises. For example, during the pandemic, they had a special credit line that was put together by the board and by the assembly like in a month and a half after the pandemic started. And basically, I think that those are the things that have made FLAD successful. Also, I think that what contributes to it being so efficient for the members is that they have trust in each other. They trust each other. They are transparent in the way they deal with themselves, and well, basically that's all.
I'm sure folks will have other questions about it, but thanks for that insight. If I could, so I'm gonna try to ask each person one question just to get things going, and you folks think, and we can open it up as a global conversation. And please introduce yourself so we can all get to know each other and have a global conversation about this stuff. So as I alluded to, Cecilia was an executive director at the World Bank last year during a pretty momentous period. I should note that this is the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference up the street in New Hampshire that founded the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen about a year ago acknowledged that, like we said earlier, that these institutions aren't necessarily fit for purpose for the 21st century, and spurred what they call an evolution, not necessarily a reform, but an evolution agenda. And Cecilia, you were part of what's called the G11, a group of developing countries that try to work together, because the way that the World Bank works is that a handful of shareholders, such as the U.S., have a lot of voting power, and so developing countries try to work together to have joint positions to get their voice and their representation heard. And what would you say? Can you share some of the experiences of that evolution process? How important is it? How were you able to get it to where it is, and then now where you're sitting in another bank, but also working about thinking how all of these things should be working as a system? What'd you learn from the World Bank situation, and how can we go even further?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here. And thank you also for the opportunity to meet the V20 fellows. We just had a simulation of the World Bank Group board, and it went really well, so congratulations. And in fact, as you say, Kevin, I was sitting at the board of the World Bank 1 year and a half ago, when basically Janet Yellen, but all the G7 countries mostly promoted this idea of the World Bank being reformed towards something that they called the evolution. To be honest, this came very much as a surprise to many of the board members at that time, many of the representatives of developing countries. We've all been pushing for reform at the global governance and at the World Bank, but nobody was specifically thinking about this type of reform that was being promoted at that time. So initially, there was a process of basically trying to understand what is the evolution about, right? And what is in it for developing countries, what is convenient and interesting from a developing country perspective. So basically, initially, the proposal was to reflect more in the vision and the mission of the institution, this idea that the World Bank needs to have a bigger role addressing global challenges. And initially, some countries pushed for a list of 3 global challenges. You may remember which ones they were if you follow this closely. It was basically climate change, pandemics, and conflict and fragility, right? So the reaction from some of the countries from the Global South, including Argentina and others, was that this was a very good 3 global challenges that clearly the World Bank needed to address boldly. But that the list was longer, first, because there were other challenges that were also important for many developing countries, but also that whatever the World Bank did in this evolution, trying to address these global challenges, should never come at the expense or be a trade-off with addressing national development challenges, basically the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also some regional challenges. So this created a very significant negotiation process inside the board of the World Bank and with the governors, trying to make this evolution balanced. Balanced for the interest and the priorities of all the different constituencies that are reflected in a 25 chairs at the board of the World Bank. So the issue of no trade-offs, for example, between climate investments and poverty alleviation investments, no trade-off, between trying to address issues of pandemics, but not at the expense of investments in human development when it involves education, social protection. This was a big part of the negotiations, right? It's like we cannot finance bigger action on climate at the expense of more timid, less strong action on human development. Or we cannot fight the reduction of mitigation or of emissions at the global level at the expense of doing less for climate adaptation, for example. So there has been a very significant process of negotiations. I think it was a very good process. One key lesson from that is that the Global South countries, the G11 countries, the developing countries, who are ultimately the clients of these multilateral development banks, needed to act together and be together, and this was really very important. But also the countries, the largest shareholders, who are really open to listen and to engage in a dialogue, because ultimately for these reforms, to be powerful and to be implemented and to be successful, they need to have ownership from everybody around the table, not just the largest shareholders, but in fact all shareholders. So at some point, the board agreed on a list of 8 global challenges. So to the original list of 3, there was an addition of other ones that are very important, like food security, for example, was incorporated to the list. Like, for example, digitalization, which is a very relevant challenge for many people in our region. The issues of energy and energy access in particular were incorporated to the list. So basically this reflected a more balanced issue, but also the dynamic of all of this not being at the expense of implied that the discussion was not only about making a better bank, more fit for purpose in terms of the goals, but also a bigger institution. Because if the challenges are bigger, if the challenges are clearly putting development at risk all throughout the world, we also need, as the MDB system, bigger resources. So the bigger discussion was and has been very tough, but there's been a lot of progress over the last year, not only at the World Bank, in other institutions. Basically now, there has been a lot of progress in terms of optimizing the use of the balance sheet of these institutions. So there's been a lot of innovative tools to try to leverage more the resources of the institutions, hybrid capital, guarantee platforms, a lot of innovation. So now whatever is in these institutions is basically being multiplied to be more impactful. 200 billion have been leveraged from all these banks. But of course, this is not enough. So many countries have also been asking for the need to have capital increases and to have even more ambition on the financial side to finance SDGs, to finance the fight against these global challenges, and to really be fit for purpose, not only in terms of the goals, but also in terms of the ambition and the resources that are mobilized to deliver development. So this has been some of the discussions that I've been involved. Very exciting, very intense, and I think with a very good outcome, but clearly this is only the start.
Can we go to the fellows now? For our V20 fellows, climate change has been a concern in climate vulnerable countries for many years now. but international financial institutions are just now catching up. And even then, many climate vulnerable countries do not have adequate voice and representation at the IMF or the World Bank. How have you and your Ministry of Finance navigated a system that wasn't designed with the needs of developing countries in mind, especially the climate vulnerable countries? We did a study last year, and I think your collective share of the vote at the International Monetary Fund is something like 4 or 5%. And what would a fit-for-purpose system look like from your vantage points in Kenya, the Maldives, Haiti? Please, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thanks for the opportunity. Addressing climate change in climate vulnerable countries requires concentrated effort from international financial institutions. So in order to get our voices heard in a traditionally in a system where there was very less focus on developing nations, we are trying to engage with our partners to get our voices heard. And we are trying to focus on negotiating and creating financial instruments which fit the development needs of our country and also the climate goals. I would say a fit-for-purpose financial architecture, in my view, would be inclusive financial for all, and also would consider accessibility of financial services to all segments of the societies, including small, medium enterprises and also marginalized communities.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us here. I come from the continent of Africa, and a country in the eastern side of the continent, a very vulnerable country to the impacts of climate change. So we not only see climate change as just an environmental issue, but a development issue. And that's why the ministries of finance, the ministries responsible for planning, we're actively now engaged in the climate change discussions, whether you're talking of mainstreaming of these actions and so on. And as you said, we recognize that the current system has not been favorable to us, especially the most vulnerable countries. But we've been taking steps, and I want to enumerate some of the actions that we've taken as a country in Kenya, and especially at the Ministry of Finance. Initially, climate change was a Ministry of Environment issue. Right now, the Ministries of Finance are taking center stage, not only at the political level, but also at the technical level. In Kenya, we've developed the necessary policies, the necessary strategies and frameworks to be able to position ourselves, to be able to address the impacts of climate change. And I've been fortunate that I've been part and parcel of some of the engagements that we've had in the country. And I'll give some of the few examples. We developed a policy in Kenya called a National Policy on Climate Finance, which enumerates a number of issues that we want to see moving forward to be able to attract, to mobilize resources, and to be able to do a number of issues, developing the necessary policy and legislative framework for us as a country. And as a result of that work, we are able to enact one of the first legislations on climate change in the country, which provides a very high-level political undertaking as us as a country to be able to engage in the climate change space. We've also been able to create and establish a unit specifically at the Ministry of Finance to deal with climate change issues. So one unique thing about our Climate Change Act mentions that every government institution must have a climate change unit. And why do we need that one? Because we want to mainstream these climate change actions in our development planning process so that each and every sector in our economy actually addresses the issues of climate change. So we have a unit dedicated to addressing climate change, and that's a unit that has been helping in terms of coordinating a number of issues and there. Kenya has also been pushing for, of course, the reforms that we're talking now in terms of reforming the current system to be a fit-for-purpose system. And we are fortunate that it has taken even at the political stage by the presidency pushing for reforms. And last year, we hosted the first climate change a summit in Kenya. It was the first summit in the continent of Africa, and it's been adopted now as more of a biennial summit that will be happening in the continent of Africa to champion for issues of climate change. And one of the issues that was proposed and that was pushed by the summit was a fit-for-purpose system that will be able to address issues of the issues of debt sustainability in the continent, the issues of SDR, the issues of increased financial flows on climate change. And what we are saying is that we need new and additional resources, that we don't want to be able to deprive other sectors, whether you're talking of health, talking of agriculture, those are development issues. So we need additional resources to be able to address the impacts of climate change. And that is what we'll want to see as we reform the financial system. Thank you.
A friend from Haiti.
Thank you so much. So I will reply to this question on the basis of my own experiences in the field in Haiti. Climate change has become more serious and more obvious. It's important to facilitate dialogue between all economic and actors on sustainable development and climate change in the context of overlapping crises in Haiti. The climate change has been one of the key drivers in many natural disasters in Haiti during last year. The impact of climate change has already significantly affected the livelihood and living conditions in Haiti, especially among the poorest and most vulnerable people. As Ministry of Finance employees, so what we are doing, we try to draw attention to the impact of climate change across of the country. One of the big roles of the Ministry of Finance is contributing and supporting climate action by other government departments and stakeholders. Climate change can be instrumental for the Ministry of Finance to achieve its core priority in terms of macroeconomic stability, growth, and responsible management for public finance. And there will be major benefits for the society, for the development in terms of tackling, escalating macroeconomic risks, generating growth and development opportunities, including jobs and investment, and also enhancing climate and financial resilience. Regarding that, I think it's important to make change to improve governance, coordination, and leadership inside of the Ministry and Finance. In case of Haiti, I will give you some good action taken by the Ministry of Finance to integrate a climate action, climate policy into our national budget. We have a subscription from CRIF. CRIF is the Caribbean Catastrophe Insurance Facility. We have in police, we cover from 3 events: hurricane, earthquake, and excess wind. The Ministry of Finance also has played a pivotal role in the preparation of our national disaster risk management. Haiti is vulnerable to climate change. It's important to improve, strengthen our national capacity to respond to climate shocks. And also, we are working with the support of V20 to prepare our climate prosperity plan. So we will hope that we will beneficiate financing from international institutions to support the implementation of this plan. As you know very well, Haiti doesn't have access to capital market. It's a fragile state. It's vulnerable to climate change. It's facing overlapping crises in this moment. We need concessional financing to finance our development needs. Our fiscal space is really low. It's important that the international community provide us more grants, more concessional financing to address our development needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna Maria, if I could come back to you. Obviously, your region has been racked by La Nina and El Nino events, but on the other hand, one of your major sources of foreign exchange is gas, oil, et cetera. We are part of something called the Task Force on the IMF Development and Climate Change, and one of our studies found that countries like Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago, Mexico, their state-owned oil company is sometimes the source of 40 to, and in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, upwards of 60% of all government revenue. So when we move to a climate transition to net zero, this is going to have major financial and fiscal implications for the countries. So what's the role of an institution like FLAR to help manage countries' ability to respond to the kinds of shocks that all of your countries are having when it comes to Mother Nature's shocks, but also doing the right thing, especially in the global north, the places that buy all your oil and gas. What kind of role can institutions like the FLAR play to help manage those transitions? And since you worked at the CAF too, what's the role of these kind of public institutions to be responding to these shocks and making a transition in a way that is not just about carbon and climate change, but making sure that countries are fiscally sustainable at the same time?
Yes. I'll talk about the FLAR countries that are fossil fuel exporters, which is Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia. I read this paper of the task force, very interesting.
All right, read away.
Yes, and so I'm going to refer to various of the conclusions of that study. The first thing is that fiscal revenues will decline substantially. I mean, nobody is properly addressing the fact that this transition for fossil fuel exporters is going to be so hard on our economic and social well-being. And it's going to happen very fast because the compromises we have with the world makes it even more pressing for us to make changes for net zero emissions. What will happen with the decline in the fiscal revenues? Well, we have a tighter fiscal space. It's like the perfect storm. We have a tight fiscal space, but we have to face a lot of challenges for the transition. We have to improve the sustainability of our fiscal policies to drive economic recovery. We have to finance and the energy transition, the requirements of energy transitions. We have to address growing pressures to increase public expenditure in education, healthcare, social protection. We have to make structural reforms to diversify our exports. We have to promote innovation and adaptation. We have to, for new technologies, we have to protect the vulnerable population that is going to suffer with this transition in terms of their work skills. The change in the economic matrix makes them unemployable to a certain extent. So the question is, what can we do? What can the regional institutions do? Well, I think the list is endless. No, but I'll just, name a few. Financial assistance, well, it's the basic one, with loans, with guarantees, with by blended finance, mobilizing private sector resources, providing technical knowledge, promoting policy dialogue to support climate action, etc. And with respect to FLAR, what could FLAR do? FLAR Well, all this is going to have an impact in the balance of payments, of course, in the current account and in the financial accounts. So FLAD has to be ready to address these crises and these needs for resources that we're going to need to make all these changes in this short period of time. So that's my answer is they can do endless things, both CAF and FLAD.
I can go ask Cecilia another question, or maybe one more for the fellows, and then we'll bring all you folks in. So Cecilia, you've left the World Bank, and now you're working with the Inter-American Development Bank, but you're working with them on their G20 agenda, and since the G20 is being hosted by Brazil, they're relying a lot on the IDB for a lot of support, and so as you move from the World Bank to thinking about the IDB, but also the G20, how should we be thinking about these things as a system, and what would you see, these especially multilateral development banks, how should we be thinking of them as a system, and what are the most important things that need to be done over the next decade?
Well, thank you for this question. I'm going to reply on my own personal perspective on this, yes, not institutional or anything. One of the good things that came up very big from the evolution effort at the World Bank that was pushed by many countries across the board was this idea that multilateral development banks really had to work better as a system. You know, that there's a significant fragmentation of the system, and when you are a country, let's say Argentina, and you are getting financing and support and knowledge from all the different institutions, you have to deal with different procurement systems. You have to deal with different ESG systems, you know. You have to deal with a lot of specificities that are for each institution that make it very troublesome, very tiring, and honestly, very inefficient sometimes. So one of the key things is that this idea of MDBs working as a system, and this implies, for example, further harmonization of procurement and mutual reliance arrangements. So MDBs can really be more agile and can rely more on each other, so when they lend resources to a country, the country can know better how to work. The issue of project preparation, for example, and how long it takes for countries to work with these multilateral development banks to prepare a project has also been part of the conversation. Because at the World Bank, when all these conversations began, it was established that on average, from a project to get to the board, it took 24 months. So that's 2 years of project preparation. And with governments usually changing every 4 or 5 years, this meant that a lot of times that one government would initiate a project that they wouldn't even be able to start implementing. You know, of course, these institutions work with countries, not with governments, but the governments do establish priorities. So this long time of preparation has been identified also as a problem, right? So this idea of MDBs learning from each other and partnering with each other to be more agile in the implementation of the projects, in the delivery, has been very clear. Last week there was a very interesting retreat of the heads of all the multilateral development banks. There's a public statement that was made in which basically all the heads of these institutions, you know, from Asia to Africa to Latin America to the World Bank, commit to work as a system for greater impact at a greater scale, to really take advantage of the knowledge, to take advantage of the technical work. They have agreed, for example, one thing that is interesting related with climate. Also on Saturday, it was released a common approach by all the climate heads of all the multilateral development banks on how to measure and track results in climate adaptation and mitigation. This is still work in progress. It's not a final product, so there's going to be more continuation. But basically this idea is that many MDBs can really agree on some indicators, on some frameworks to track what they are doing so they can have a better idea of the impact all these resources are having to eventually take the decisions needed to be more impactful. Of course, this needs a strong ownership and engagement of the countries. You know, this is not only about the MDBs, it's the MDBs serving the countries better, engaging with the clients better. In fact, public sector, but also private sector, because a lot of these institutions also work with the private sector, like IFC or BidInvest or the EBRD. So I think there's a very exciting agenda now going on in terms of MDBs working together and trying to learn from each other and to simplify make it easier for countries to work. So I'm very happy that this is happening, and I think again there's a lot to go, but there's been recent good news that it's good to take a look at.
Well, we're happy you're in the middle of that.
Well,
If I could ask one question for all three of the fellows, and then I promise to open it up to all the folks in the audience. What would you say one of your biggest national challenges is that you're struggling with on climate change, climate adaptation, and development in your country, and how can being part of the V20, a new coalition here, help you achieve your national goals?
As Hillary mentioned in his opening remarks, I think climate change has been an issue of the Environment Ministry until very recently. So our Ministry of Finances around the world, I think, are recognizing, specifically for Maldives, we are starting to recognize the significant impacts it would have on fiscal policies and also overall infrastructure of the country. So I would say that it is very important for us to engage with our partners and also come up with frameworks that are out there. Like we have recently worked on integrated national financing frameworks and environmental social governance frameworks. So our purpose is to use these frameworks to mobilize new sources of climate financing and also align our fiscal policies with development goals.
Thank you. I think for us, as you mentioned, the challenge of climate change, I think it's an important aspect in our development progress that needs to be addressed. And Kenya, just like any other developing country, and especially in the sub-Saharan Africa, is vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Our sectors are the climate-sensitive sectors. You talk of agriculture, you talk of energy, you talk of tourism. Right now, if you're a tourist, and then you can't stay in Nairobi because Nairobi is flooded now. And that's a sector that is contributing 30% of our GDP. And so that means we lose a lot in terms of what we do. Agriculture, the same case. This year we haven't had rains in January but this year we had rains in January. So that means that even the farmers who are doing 80% of the workforce is from agriculture. So they can't be able to predict and plan themselves, and so that means we need to put in measures appropriate as a country and also increase the financing. And also we are faced with a situation whereby the financing is not available. So despite that, we've made some progress in terms of aligning ourselves, speaking to our NDC goals, making some key ambitions in our NDC, reducing our emissions, even though we are contributing 0.03%, but mostly action on adaptation, very ambitious, but of course the resources are challenging. Being here and of course our membership and our engagement in the V20 and the climate change discourse, I think it's very important. 5 years ago, our debt department couldn't understand what is, when we engaged on issues of green bond, saying, this thing is quite difficult. Why don't we just proceed with the normal vanilla bonds, the Euro bonds and so on? Right now, they are on our desks as a climate change unit, trying, because development partners have also changed their financing models and so on. We're currently discussing issues of debt. Issues of climate change have gone to the ministerial level now, and the ministers and so on are active. 5 years ago, ministries of finance used not to attend COPs. Right now, they're active in COPs. So I think platforms like V20 are really bringing in the issues of climate change into the forefront of the ministries of finance, as I mentioned earlier, and bringing in issues of climate change, as I mentioned earlier, as a development issue that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. As I said earlier, the case of Haiti is special. We are a fragile state. We are vulnerable to climate change. We don't have access to financial market. In my experience with V20, I said maybe most of the propositions are fit for upper middle income countries, not for my country. When we're talking about debts, when you are talking about other financial instruments, they are not for Haiti because we cannot afford this kind of instrument. I think it's important, for example, for the discussion on IDA replenishment, IDA 21st, the V20 need to help us to make advocacy for more constitutional resources. One of the vehicles of IDA, for example, CRW, is really important for Haiti because it's already impacted by climate change. When there's a disaster in Haiti, we beneficiate financing from the World Bank by the CRW. It's an important instrument for us. We need grant, we need constitutional financing. So I think in the V20 agenda, there's a need to focus more on grant constitutional financing for countries like Haiti. One more point, I think is partnership. Partnership is important to help countries. It's not only financing, but it's also engaging with other stakeholders at the national level and at the international level. In the case of Haiti, now UN agency play a big role in help World Bank, EIDB to implement projects. In the agenda of climate action, I think it's important also to see how we can promote partnership through UN agency, NGO, and other private organizations to support better the country need. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, folks, you heard it from all of them. They're all on the front lines of financing climate change development in their own countries and on the global stage. Let me open it up for some questions and answers. And these are all really fun and nice people. Feel free to ask them about these, these big pressing issues of the day. But especially for those of you who are BU students, you want to be these people someday. And so ask them questions about that too. All I ask is that you identify yourself, and please, fellows, ask questions too, so we can all just get to know each other a little bit. Why don't I take 2 or 3 at a time and then let anyone respond and see how many rounds we do. And Sam, you'll wave and tell me to stop at some point. So who's gonna be first?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This question is for Cecilia. So my name is Si Wu. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at Boston University. Thank you so much for sharing your understanding of the major global challenges of the day. I'm just curious about what you think of the issue of demographic decline and the aging population, because I know this is a problem that a lot of countries in the world are grappling with right now, and I see that probably in the next few decades there'll be difficulties in terms of how they provide welfare policies to support the aging population structure. So I was wondering how international organizations are seeing this issue right now. Thank you.
We had two over here.
Thank you. I'm Mamiso. I'm from the Kingdom of Eswatini. I'm a V20 fellow. And my question also goes to Cecilia. Fortunately or unfortunately, she's getting a question. So, Cecilia, I'm interested in finding out, with your experience, of course, having been an executive director at the World Bank, and we are from countries in the sub-Saharan Africa region, and Kevin highlighted that our voting is we don't have a voice essentially, and we are saying one of the key reforms should be for such countries to be well represented, and in the reform or in the evolution agenda of the bank, it doesn't want to reform, but it can evolve, whatever that means. In your experience and maybe your personal opinion, what is the outlook in terms of these voiceless countries? Does it look like they will be getting what they are pushing for. Organizations like the V20, are they going to have the space to even make a dent in the reform agenda? What has been the pushback of those that want to dominate the bank and push their own agenda, these big countries? Can you share your experience on that?
Thank you, Kelvin, and many thanks to the panelists. It has been a really insightful panel. Unfortunately, my question too is for Cecilia. Yeah, because for me, I find it really ironic that we've all agreed that the Green Climate Fund is the largest or main fund for addressing climate issues. However, a greater part of climate resources is channeled through the World Bank, or the World Bank is the biggest provider of climate finance. And given the current situation we are in, the debt crisis, it has been noticed that 85% of funding that has been channeled to developing countries in the form of loans are coming from multilateral development banks. So majority of it would be from the World Bank as well, because you are the greatest contributor. You have the greatest resources for climate finance. So for me, I was wondering, as an executive director, the fact that currently, as we speak, most of the grant resources are coming from the climate funds, which is Green Climate Fund or Adaptation Fund. So don't you think it's more ideal that majority of the resources are channeled through the climate funds who provide much of the resources in grant financing rather than loan than the World Bank that basically has the greatest amount of resources but provides it in the form of loans? So coming from the global south, what's your opinion on it? Thank you.
Okay, one more question and then we'll go, and it's somebody on this side and not for Cecilia. That's it. And everything Cecilia says is in her own.
Thank you very much to the panelists for those insights on work that we do. My name is Tsitsi Musasuke. I'm a professor at Pardee, School of Global Studies. My question is directed to the fellows. And I have a question for you as well, Cecilia, but for now, my question is to the fellows. To what extent have your countries been able to mobilize mitigation funding? We know that a lot of money is going into adaptation funding. We know that a lot of funding is going into mitigation funding because of the potential to make quick bucks, a lot of money in mitigation. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I saw a couple other hands over here. We'll see if we've got time after these folks respond. And maybe fellows first, since you've got a lot of thinking to do with all these questions you got. Folks want to respond?
Yeah, I'll start. So looking at the adaptation expenditures we spent from our national budget, in 2022, around $98 million was spent from the national budget alone for mitigation and adaptation projects. So if this is directly hitting, then which could have been sourced to other development projects, but instead these funds has to be used for mitigation purposes, because mostly for shore protection, because the islands are very low-lying, and for the survival of the people of the islands, it is necessary that the shores are protected. So otherwise, we could have, if we could have received grants or concessional financing for these sort of projects, I'm sure we would have been able to utilize these funds for more usable development, income-generating projects, which would be, which would generate more income to the government in the future.
So for Kenya, our priorities are on adaptation, but of course we are doing mitigation actions. From the statistics and data that we have, is that even though our priorities are on adaptation, most of the resources are actually flowing towards mitigation actions. One, because we have made some significant progress in renewable energy, and especially on geothermal, which is capital intensive in nature, and we are doing now over 90% of our grid being from renewable energy. So that means most of our resources are on mitigation actions. But currently there's a number of actions that we put in place to ensure that we mobilize more resources for adaptation, and we have one of the biggest projects now led by the Ministry of Finance called Financing Locally Led Climate Action, which is a more multi-donor, multi-sector project to finance resources at the local level. Thank you.
Yes, in the case of Haiti, what I can say, we don't have enough national financing resource to finance our adaptation projects. Most of them, but let's say 100% of them, they are financed by international financing from World Bank, EIDB, and the Caribbean Development Bank, and we have some bilateral donors like EU, France, Canada, Spain, that finance adaptation project in Haiti. But in our budget, we integrate the premium we paid for the parametric insurance. It costs the government more than $7 million per year to pay for the 3 insurance policy to CRIF. It's expensive for us, it's costly. I think it's important, it's a recommendation for V20. I think subsidy for premium, it's relevant for low-income countries like Haiti, because our budget is restrictive. We don't have enough fiscal space to pay each year $7 or $10 million per year. Even it's important for us to improve the financial resilience of the country. But we have the will to finance more adaptation project, but we don't have enough fiscal space. That's why we are counting on international donors to finance our adaptation projects. Regarding a mitigation measure, as you know, there's also opportunity related to a climate action. It's not only impact. So now we are developing the renewable energy market in Haiti. There's a lot of SME in the renewable energy market that's selling solar panel. There's a huge opportunity in this sector in Haiti. In terms of government, the government tried to put in place a good governance framework to facilitate the integration of renewable energy in our energy plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. Do you hear me? Yeah. So I tackled them in the order that they came up. The first one, you were asking if there were discussions in terms of the aging populations and the impact they may have. I haven't identified that conversation to be part of the evolution, to be honest, but certainly it's part of the conversations that are taking place at the World Bank, at the G20, and in other forums. It's quite interesting that, in fact, the conversation goes many ways, because yes, there's some populations that are facing an aging problem and the demographics are playing against it, let's say, but there's other countries and regions, Africa in its entirety, that is having the different problem or opportunity, right, with growing population and with really a lot of young people coming or having the opportunity to join the labor force. And that's the conversation that I have really heard about. And in fact, the African chairs at the World Bank, I think, have been quite effective in highlighting that there's a major opportunity for Africa, given its new demographics and expected demographics. But of course, for this, we not only need more growth, but more inclusive growth and job creation of the type of jobs that are good to be doing, right? So decent jobs. So that's certainly a key element of the conversation. And I think this really shows that we have very much, as we know, a very fragmented international system with all different situations. You have, aging population in some places, and the opposite in others. Demographics that are shrinking. Argentina, for example, is very stable in terms of its demographic. It has not been growing very vividly. And then other countries in Latin America even that have the opposite situation. So there's a lot of individual situations, and I think this has been very much highlighted all throughout the negotiations at the World Bank, and they are important that there's no one-size-fits-all policies, and that eventually each country needs to take what serves them better from the offer from MDBs and the different climate funds, and it's eventually the country-led process that has to establish their priorities. In terms of the Africa participation, my sense is that, as you were saying, and as we know, the formal representation of Latin America, Africa, Asia in the board of these institutions is clearly below the current weight of all these regions at the global level, right? They out-represent in general some big economies, and some smaller economies are underrepresented because they were created 80 years ago and the shareholding hasn't changed much. So if you are guided by the formal voting power of the global south, then of course there's not much influence that you can have. But I think that the big opportunity is that your voice and your influence and your capacity to really impact the outcomes of these institutions cannot be only guided by your formal voting power. And I've seen that Africa, for example, and the African chairs, even though they are the 3 smallest chairs in terms of voting power within the 25, if I'm not mistaken, within the 25, I think Africa is the last 3. I think that the chair I represented was like the 4th at the latest, the 21st. So yeah, we were smaller chairs, right? With like 2%, 1.8%, sometimes even less than 1% voting power. So if you're guided for that, then you better go home, right? But that's the opportunity to be at the table. That's the opportunity to engage and influence in the conversation. That's the opportunity to engage with other countries. And sometimes it's not only developing countries that can be your partners. On many issues in the agenda, for example, on the gender, our constituency, the Southern Cone, has been always very strong on gender issues. We had partners and allies all across the income spectrum, right? With the US, we had a big partnership on that, and we were really pushing for gender policies in that sense. With Canada, we were really pushing, and maybe some developing countries that were good partners for some parts of the agenda were not so good partners when it comes to gender, right? They were more silent, looking to other side, or to labor rights. For example, not all countries in the South have the same position on labor rights. So I think that it's really important. That's my humble lesson from all these years representing countries that are not so powerful in terms of the voting, but that you need to use that opportunity. And I felt that always the colleagues from Africa at the World Bank have always tried to do that and to partner among each other. Of course, Africa itself is also super diverse, 54 countries, 3 chairs, very different agendas. So sometimes it's even harder among Africa or among Latin America, you know this very well, to come together. But we really need to keep trying. So I think that's really important, to use that opportunity to make the most out of it. In terms of the climate, there's a very interesting initiative that is being championed by Brazil now in the G20, which is to do a whole review of the international climate architecture. I think this is very much needed. My personal view, and we've been saying this at the World Bank, is that there's a significant fragmentation of this. I've just learned that there's a very good study that the French government did last year that shows that on top of the 4 major climate funds, the Green Climate Fund being one of them, there's also 90 individual smaller funds, many of them bilateral, that are being implemented now. And this level of dispersion and atomization, I don't think it's very efficient. Probably we need something like Brazil is doing to review and to try to make sense to this. I personally don't see as a problem that the World Bank or the MDBs are channeling a good part of this. The problem is that the other part is really small, right? The problem is that there's not enough grant money for loss and damage, for climate adaptation. So I think that that's where we really need, as a world, to be able to get more resources to support climate adaptation. That, as I was saying, is currently I think it's around 35% of international funds that go to adaptation, as opposed to mitigation that gets more than 60 at the global level. So that's the issue mostly, that there's not enough resources. Because the issue of affordability, I do agree with colleagues, and you mentioned that at the beginning, there is a major issue, right? With these debt levels, it's really hard to get more and more debt. But the multilateral development banks serve a lot of middle-income countries that have access to these resources, and because there's climate co-benefits, a good part of that is being channeled to climate financing, which I think is a good thing, as long as you have resources and good prices to do the other stuff. Thank you.
I'm told we have a little room for a couple more questions. We'll have one in the front and one in the back here.
My name is Adham Badawi. I'm a PhD student at...
Here we go.
Oh, now it's good? Yeah.
Good to see you.
My name is Adham Badawi. I'm a PhD researcher at BU in the Department of Earth and Environment, and my research is on climate adaptation. So a question for you, Cecilia, is we talked about like the climate adaptation gap, and it's increasing, right? Like with all these hard-hitting climate impacts. So how could we leverage more climate finance for climate adaptation projects, especially if all of these projects can align with global development and the aspirations of these developing economies? So how can we leverage more finance for these projects?
Great. I think we got the gentleman with the big vest back there.
Thank you. Bill Crane with the Global Development Policy Center. This question is for Ana Maria. If we look at the usage of the global financial safety net, so switching gears and thinking a bit about liquidity finance over the past decade, increasingly bilateral swaps have become a critical component. While that scale of financing and additional financing is great, some have been concerned about the extent to which it undermines multilateral institutions like the FLAR, because it's so quick and easy and it's just bilateral. Lots of countries get left out and can fall through the net. If you could implement two kind of policy prescriptions just by waving a magic wand within the global financial safety net, what would those be to ensure that the global financial safety net is underpinned by a truly multilateral and collaborative and coordinated system?
Okay, we got two quick ones right here. We got the gentleman with the blue shirt, our fellow. Okay, just this one.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that elaborate discussion. I have a number of them, but I'll try to be brief. The first one is the discussion from theory to practical. I just want to ask a simple question. What strategies as vulnerable countries do we have in place to be able to bring the private sector on board? Many a times when we have this discussion, the private sector is left out as if it never exists. So that is my first question. The other thing that I want to find out is the fact that when the question was asked about the challenges facing the vulnerable countries, I was thinking aloud. Do we have readily pipeline available to be able to attract investors? That is very key, because often than not, it doesn't happen. The other most important thing that has been touched on is the resources abundance that we have on the continent. Unfortunately, the freeze continues to be a problem for us. Abundance of resources leads to chaos. How can we turn these resources to our advantage to be able to support a business case for adaptation? Because our strength is within adaptation, even though we sometimes are much interested in mitigation related issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we let each person respond to any of those and say any last word? Why don't we start all the way from here?
Let me, on the private sector engagement, I think for a country like Haiti, in terms of climate action, the private sector is not yet engaged, but we can try to engage the private sector. I think IFC from World Bank can play a huge role in helping a government to engage a private sector. I just talk about opportunities in renewable energy. So we need technical assistance from IFC to de-risking the environment. Look at a country like Haiti, we are facing overlapping crises. So now it's complicated for the private sector to involve or to think about investment in climate action. So what we need to do, it's important to beneficiate support from IFC and other international institutions to prepare a good framework for investment. It's important. And also they can try to put money. They create PSW to facilitate private investment in fragile situation. I don't know yet if it exists a special vehicle inside of the World Bank to support a private investment in climate-related projects in developing countries, especially in countries most vulnerable to climate change. I think it will be a good idea if IFC and other international organizations can prepare a framework, a special vehicle to support private investment in climate action in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll also respond in the line of private sector engagements. For the case of Kenya, we have more of a vibrant private sector. But what we've tried to do at the national level is to bring them on board. Remember, we supported our private sector, Kenya Private Sector Alliance, to develop their own strategy in terms of engagement on climate change. It was supported by some funding from the GCF. So they've also been able to create networks and so on. But in terms of the institutional structure, we have the private sector being actually at the top level political decision making. That's the National Climate Change Council that is being chaired by the president. We have a representative from the private sector at that level. But what have we done in terms of bringing the private sector on board or incentivizing the private sector? From the Ministry of Finance perspective, we've developed a policy on fiscal incentives, because we've been having a situation whereby we don't have coherence in how the government provide incentives, especially in the green space. This year we've given an incentive on solar. Next year the finance bill removes that one. So we've developed a policy to guide and to be able to ensure that the private sector have a more coherent, they are more predictable in how they can be able to invest in the climate change space. Secondly, was on the different financing frameworks and the green bond. The national government guided the discussion on the green bonds, and successfully we had the private sector actually moving faster than the government in terms of issuing the first corporate green bond. So it shows the activeness and the engagement. Of course, the efforts are not sufficient. We'll hope that we'll be able to do much. And in terms of the conclusion, I think I'll echo the words of Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, where she used to use the fable of a hummingbird, that whatever small you can do, you can be able to do much. So I think climate change is a sector that needs not only professionals, we also need policymakers, we also need a lot of resources in the space. So whatever small that we can be able to do, we'll be able to do something impactful. Thank you.
I would also say that in my experience, Maldives also has a very vibrant private sector, but I would say in terms of investments in climate adaptation or mitigation, private sector is not very much involved. It's highly public sector investments in Maldives for most of the climate-related projects. So I would say to attract private investments, government has been trying to bring in private investments in terms of climate finance, renewable energy as well, but I would say it has not been very successful so far, but I would say to attract investments, we could give incentives like taxes can be, I think, introduced taxes. There are very high taxes on Maldives, so maybe some levy on those things. Such things, I think there are some areas where we can work on to attract private investments. And also in our country's experience, we face high public backlash whenever there is private investments, especially if it is a foreigner. So I think transparency is also very important when dealing with private investors.
Yeah, clearly the discussion on how to engage the private sector and how to get the private sector to invest more in sustainable development, it's a very challenging one, and there are no easy answers. The MDBs have this very high in the agenda. One way in which many banks are tackling this is to try to work more integrated within the sovereign part and the private sector part. In the case of the World Bank, you know, the IBRD and the IFC, to try to identify in which areas maybe they can work together so that there's a part of the projects, for example, that is financed through sovereign lending, but there's also a part of the project that maybe has sense and it's adequate for the private sector to be involved, so they can also weigh in that part. So there's a really renewed effort to work as a group. And this is not only true for the World Bank, but also for the IDB and other institutions. There are also new models that are being developed, this idea of originate to share. I don't know if you've heard about this. The new capitalization of the IDB that was approved like a month ago. It's based on the IDB Invest, the private sector, is based on this concept of originate to share, which it's complex, but basically means that the banks work to generate the projects, to incentivize the private sector to be involved, so they co-invest with the private sector at the beginning. But eventually, when the project matures, the multilateral development banks reduce their participation to the minimum for the project to keep going, but in a way that they can recover part of the capital to support and promote other projects, while these projects that have been created continue, right? So it's trying to identify which is the size of the investment of their own equity that the MDBs need to have in a certain project, private sector project, to guarantee that that project happens, but also that there's resources limited to facilitate other projects. So there's a lot of discussion of different models. One thing that I think is particularly relevant and it cuts across is the idea that developing countries need to, of course, keep doing better in identifying pipelines of bankable projects, you know, which means that they really need to identify which are the priorities, which are the needs of the specific projects, and to present them and prepare them in an integral way, you know, so that if there's investors interested, there's a pipeline of projects that can be financeable. Of course, there's issues of risk, there's issues of public policy frameworks. It's a complex process, but having good projects that are worth investing in and that have really all the studies, technical studies associated with them, I think it's a good investment in any case, because hopefully that's the beginning of important investments in the country. So there's a set of things that you can do that when I was part of the government in Argentina, we always try to do, and this included identifying important projects in adaptation. We issued a national mitigation adaptation plan. Well, in fact, we call it National Adaptation and Mitigation Plan to highlight the adaptation, which for Argentina was particularly important, given all the vulnerabilities that we have, droughts, floods, you name it. And this national plan had a very clear set of bankable projects to leverage. Some of them for public resources, some of them may be adequate for private sector, and many of them for joint investments, which can be the way forward. Last comment, that I think it's also worth taking a look at is all the work that is being done in the US and other advanced economies on industrial policy related with promoting investments in climate. You know, here what we see with the Tesla and all that. So clearly there's also room, I think, to think industrial policy in the 21st century for developing countries, taking on the lessons and kind of rethinking these issues. And there's good papers by Mazzucato, by Rodrik, by other authors, well, Kevin himself, that try to think this from a developing country perspective. It's not the same, but maybe there are good ideas also to think that, you know, how you can use the policies to promote more investments in the climate sector within the governments of the nations in the South.
Thank you, Bill, for your very easy question. So I think that I have more of a practical approach. If you think that RFAs are for global macroeconomic and financial stability, I don't think that there's any problem with the swaps agreements and that they don't undermine what the RFAs are doing. And if we talk about RFAs, we would have to divide them into the big ones and the ones that need to grow. So with respect to the ones that are on their own and don't need, let's say, the IMF, they could do their thing, the European mechanism, for example, they don't need the IMF. But for example, FLAR, or the Arab Monetary Fund, or the Eurasian Fund, that they're too small. They're too small. They need to be bigger, and that has proven to be very challenging to make them grow. So my wish would be that the little ones would be more practical and establish joint programs with the IMF and work intensely on how they can access more resources, because at the end of the day, the only concern is that you have the money that you need when a country needs it. So I think that we need more practical visions in general in the RFA world.
Thanks so much. Hey, I want to thank Dean Taylor and the Pardee School and the staff of the Pardee School that helped us put that on. And on behalf of Dean Taylor and myself, we really want to thank all of you folks for coming here. You're all talking about how you're under-resourced and there's not enough stuff, there's not enough time. And here you come to Boston University to share and co-learn with all of us. We really appreciate that. And all of the other fellows that came, and obviously all the students. These are an incredible group of people to learn and be inspired for. And think about that as you go back to your classroom and you go round out the end of the semester, that there's these people out here on the front lines trying to work on the issues that you folks are thinking about. And as our title is today, it's soon after you graduate going to be time to put some of these ideas to action. And there's no better example than the people that you've been able to engage with today. Let's continue the conversation a little bit more informally. We've got a great reception outside. And on top of every single table out there, there's a little QR code. And you can snap it and link up to our webpage, learn about all the different resources that we have on these issues at the GDP Center, and also sign up to be part of the events like this that we have over the course of the year. But before we go out there, please help me and Dean Taylor thank these folks.